Okay, all right. So we are with you. Alyssa Gray is a professor of rabbinics at Hebrew Union College. Among her many publications, she is the author of 2 books, The Talmud in Exile and Charity in Rabbinic Judaism, Atonement, Rewards, and Righteousness. Professor Gray, please, we all hear you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. The Talmud Yerushalmi has had quite a journey since the publication of the Editio Princeps in 1523, but it also had quite a journey before that. The Yerushalmi's reception history begins with the adoption in Rabbinic Babylonia of portions of the Palestinian linkage of curated literary units of Amoraic learning to the Mishnah and other Tannaitic sources as the basis for what would become the Talmud Bavli. These Palestinian linkages, known to us in macro as the Talmud Yerushalmi, turn out to have been a crucial intellectual technology for the transmission of Palestinian Amoraic learning to Babylonia. Turning to the Yomã tractates, the written version of this paper will show that Y Yomã 1138a through d, the Yerushalmi's Gemara to M Yomã 11, is the literary inspiration for a substantial portion of the Babli's treatment of that Mishnah on B Yomã 2a to 14a. Without Y Yomã 11, the Babylonian Gemara would look quite different. Babylonian sages reflected on Palestinian analyses of and expansions on the Mishnah and other Tannaitic sources, both attributed and anonymous, and took several paths. First, they adopted, with some modifications, a sizable portion of Y Yomã 11 for inclusion in their own Gemara. I call this the textual core. The Bavli reworks the textual core in ways I have earlier identified. 4 such ways include: 1, it introduces its own characteristic terminology. 2, it tends to shorten and simplify source materials taken from the Yerushalmi. 3, it tends to create transitions between materials that lack such transitions in the Yerushalmi. And 4, it tends to place material into a more sensible order than the Yerushalmi. We also see evidence of Babylonian reflection on the Palestinian Gemara to M Yomã 11 in the Bavli's awareness and imitation of the Yerushalmi's own reuse of portions of Y Yomã 11 in other tractates. The Bavli also responds to selected literary cues in Y Yomã 11 with the formulation of new sugyot or linked sequences of sugyot. It formulates these uniquely Babylonian sugyot and sequences using both discernibly older literary sources and those of uncertain date. A few of these were interpolated into the textual core. Several others were either placed prior to or following the textual core. Understanding B Yomã's reception and adaptations of portions of Y Yomã, the textual core, is also necessary for reconstructing aspects of the Babli's intellectual history. There are patterns to B Yomã's decisions either to engage or neglect certain legal or non-legal topics found in Y Yomã. My presentation today is drawn from a larger body of research and will proceed in 5 steps. First, I will set out the textual core. Second, I will set out an example of how B Yomã adapts and reworks Y Yomã material in the textual core. Third, I will move a bit beyond the textual core to show the Babli's awareness and imitation of how the Yerushalmi uses material from its own Gemara to M Yomã 11 outside of tractate Yomã. Fourth, I will move beyond textual issues to 2 examples of patterns of inter-Talmudic intellectual difference. Fifth, I will turn from these 4 discussions of larger sequences of material to a micro-examination of 2 examples of inter-Talmudic textual reworkings or transpositions of Amoraic and Stam materials between Y Yomã 11 and B Yomã. This will lead to some inconclusive conclusions around a central finding. B Yomã 2a to 14a is the first discernible literary stage of the reception history of Y Yomã 11. Section 1, the textual core. Slide 2 illustrates the division into units of Y Yomã 11. Slide 3 illustrates the division into units of B Yomã 2a to 14a. These 2 slides are the necessary prelude to slide 4, which illustrates the textual core. B3, B4, B7, B9, and B10, in that order, utilize the parallel Yerushalmi material in the order in which it appears there, Y1 to Y5, and then Y8. B Yomã deviates from Y Yomã's order by placing B12, Y10, prior to B13, Y9, but it returns to the Yerushalmi's order with B15, Y11, and B16 to B17, Y13. In the Bavli, then, adaptations of Y1 to Y5, Y8, the reversed Y10 to Y9, Y11, and Y13 form a textual core. Yomã has arranged other materials around and within the textual core. B1 to B2 is a sort of introduction to the textual core. B5 to B6, B8, B11, and B14 are interpolations into the textual core. B18 is appended to the textual core. Today's paper, however, is focused largely on the textual core. Section 2, Yomã adapts and reworks Yomã material in the textual core. Slide 4 shows how the textual core deviates from Yomã's order in that B12 equals Y10, while B13 equals Y9. Y9 opens with a braita that points out that all the temple courtyards except for the Parhedrin court were exempt from mezuzah because Parhedrin serves as the high priest's residence 7 days a year. Y9 then goes on to explore why other courtyards do or do not have mezuzot. Y10 begins with the observation that Parhedrin was also called the Bulvatin court and goes on to explain the name change. Parhedrin hints at a reduction in the courtyard status, which Y10 attributes to the Second Temple period's frequent turnover of high priests. Mention of high priestly turnover leads Y10 into a discussion of the different reasons for the destructions of Shiloh in the First and Second Temples and why the temple was rebuilt after 587 BCE, but not after 70 CE. Y10 ends on the note that any generation in which the temple is not rebuilt, it is as if that generation destroyed it. Yomã's ordering of material is infelicitous in that it begins in Y9 with discussion of Parhedrin and mezuzah, moves into a discussion of mezuzah in relation to other courtyards, and defers until Y10, a discussion of Parhedrin's name change and the associated discussion of temple destruction and rebuilding. Yomã improves on this presentation. B12 opens with the name change from Bulvati to Parhedrin and the associated discussion about the temple destructions and rebuilding. With these issues covered, B13 switches to the topic of mezuzah completely, first in relation to Parhedrin, and only then, with Parhedrin fully explored, to a discussion of mezuzah and other temple courtyards. By the end of B13, then, Yomã's discussion of the various temple courtyards is concluded, and Yomã moves on in B14 to B15, as Yomã does in Y11, to discuss the high priest's replacement on Yom Kippur, should one be needed. Section 3, the Bavli is aware of and imitates the Yerushalmi's use of portions of Yomã 1:1 outside of Tractate Yomã. Slide 4 here shows that Y11 equals B15. The Yerushalmi also places Y11 and Y12 at Yerushalmi Horayot 3447D. The Bavli likewise places a version of B15 in a similar spot on Horayot 12b, part of the Gemara to M Horayot 34. The Yerushalmi also places Y11 and Y12 at Yerushalmi Megillah 1972a to b. Again, the Bavli presents a version of B15 at a similar spot on Megillah 9b, part of the Gemara to M Megillah 19. This shows that the formulators of the Bavli, ranging beyond Yomã, were aware of these examples of what have been called transferred sugyot in the Yerushalmi, and they transferred Bavli material accordingly. Section 4, differing intertalmudic ideational emphases. This paper has explained how Yomã improved on Yomã's presentation of material by switching the order of Y9 and Y10 in the textual core. It now remains to explore one of several other key differences between B12 and Y10. B12's addition of a Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish dispute about whether there were consequences to the Babylonian exiles' failure to return en masse to Eretz Yisrael in the days of Ezra. To set the stage, we must first examine some pertinent parallel material in Y10 and B12. This material originates in Y10 as part of its expansion of Menachot 13:22-23, which explores the reasons for the destructions of Shiloh and the First and Second Temples, as well as the current lack of a temple. B12's parallel to this Yerushalmi material also echoes Menachot, but presents its adaptation of Menachot within a framing derived from Yomã. This parallel material unfolds here on slide 5 as follows. First, some notes on textual issues. Yomã characteristically streamlines attributions. Why Yomã's multiple sages, including Rabbi Elazar, become Yomã's Rabbi Yochanan in tandem with Rabbi Elazar and Reish Lakish. Note the transmission of why Yomã's Rabbi Eliezer's Eidechem Bechira in 2 versions in Yomã. The first is as Tenu Einechem Babira. Einechem could result from an unintentional transposition of the Dalet in why Yomã's Eidechem for the Nun. Yomã's reference to Bira rather than Bechira harkens back to B1, which opens with Para 3:1's explicit mention of Bira and closes with Reish Lakish's assertion that the entire temple is referred to as Bira. Yomã's alternative textual formulation of Rabbi Elazar, the Ika de Amre, as Eidechem Bira is clearly a version of Y10's Rabbi Eliezer's statement, Eidechem Bechira. And now ideology. Y10 is consistent in its claim that the generation that followed the first temple's destruction was superior to the generation that followed the destruction of the second. The superiority is proven by the rebuilding of the temple following the first destruction, but not the second. B12 makes that point as well, with the notable exception of Reish Lakish's retort to Rabbi Yochanan. To the contrary, Adarabba, the latter ones are preferable. Even though there is subjugation to the nations, they engage in Torah. Reish Lakish introduces the notion that notwithstanding the continuing lack of a temple, the latter generations are preferable because they engage in Torah despite their subjugation to the nations. Reish Lakish's statement is in Aramaic, which is uncharacteristic of Amoraic statements and suggestive of an interpolation. A focus on the superiority of Torah study to other religious behaviors is characteristically Babylonian, but Reish Lakish is likely not referring to the Babylonians, but to latter ones in the land of Israel. On this reading, Reish Lakish is arguing that the Torah study of these Palestinian latter ones makes them superior to the Palestinian first ones, notwithstanding their lack of a temple. But Yomã attributes a rejection of this idea to none other than Rabbi Yochanan himself. Rabbi Yochanan avers that notwithstanding their pursuit of Torah study under suboptimal political conditions, the lack of a temple proves the inferiority of the sages of the land of Israel to the first ones. Yomã thus puts a negative assessment of Palestinian learning into the mouth of a Palestinian sage. And then, unlike Yomã goes on to suggest something negative about even these first ones. The second temple rebuilt after the generation of those superior first ones was inferior to the first temple. Yomã answers an implicit question why Yomã does not even ask. If those first ones were so superior, why was the second temple inferior to the first? What went wrong and whose fault was it? Yomã represents Reish Lakish as making the case for Babylonian fault. Right after the material presented here on slide 5, Yomã describes a hostile encounter between Reish Lakish and Rabbah bar Chana. Reish Lakish refuses Rabbah bar Chana's proffered hand with the blunt, "God, I hate you." He explains his strong feelings by quoting Song of Songs 8:9, which he interprets to mean that had the Babylonians made themselves into a wall and all come to the land of Israel in the days of Ezra, they would be like silver, which does not rot, and would have benefited from the divine presence. As that mass immigration had not occurred, the immigrants who did come resembled cedar, which does rot, and their experience of the divine is only through the echo of the bat kol. In short, the Babylonians' failure to come to the land en masse was responsible for the absence of the divine presence during the Second Temple period. Eretz Yisrael, in the person of Reish Lakish, therefore harbors hatred for Babylonia in the person of Rabbah bar Chana. Rabbi Yochanan's reaction to Reish Lakish's hatred initially alleviates this Babylonian anxiety. He points out that even had all the Babylonians ascended with Ezra, the divine presence still would not have been revealed. The divine presence will only shine in the tents of shame, and the temple tent was rebuilt by Persia, which is descended from Japhet. Although Yomã goes on to represent Persia's descent from Japhet as a disputed point, Yomã ultimately concludes that the Babylonian Rav Yosef is correct. Japhet's son Tiras, as per Genesis 10:2, is Persia. Rabbi Yochanan is thus vindicated. Even had all the Babylonians ascended with Ezra to the land of Israel, the divine presence still would not have been revealed. The mass Jewish presence in Babylonia is thus not responsible for the Second Temple's inferiority to the first. Further, by implication, B. Yomא tacitly suggests that the Second Temple's inferiority to the first renders its loss less intense than that of the first. B. Yomã then, unlike Y. Yomã, does not present itself as wholeheartedly mourning the Second Temple's loss. Looking beyond B12 and Y10, a second major difference of emphasis between Y and B. Yomã is that Y. Yomã is more interested in the details of the Miluim priestly dedication week on their own terms. B. Yomã, by contrast, is demonstrably more interested in conceptual issues that arise from the Miluim week, notably the question of what rituals are me'akev. This is visible in B4, but especially in B7 and B9 as compared with the Y. Yomã parallels. Let me just go back to the textual core. B7, Y4 begins with a terse statement that from this it may be inferred that both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish hold that everything written in scripture in connection with the Miluim is indispensable, ma'akev. B7 goes on to explore a pertinent legal difference between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina in a conceptual sugya. This dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina appears in Y4 with their ascribed positions reversed, as is often the case, and the ritual context in Y4 is more precisely defined as the 10th of an ephah and the priest's trousers, rather than simply as the Miluim. B. Yomã's more general reference to the Miluim suggests its lesser interest than Y. Yomã in exploring the ritual details of the Miluim week on their own terms. B7 goes on to explore the practical difference between Rabbi Yochanan's and Rabbi Chanina's positions. The exploration begins in earnest with Rav Yosef's suggestion that smicha is the difference between them. Smicha is one of two items Y4 identifies as not being ma'akev for later generations, but ma'akev for the Miluim. B7's complex sugya thus builds conceptually on a literary hint in Y4. B9 is essentially a representation of Y4 to Y5. Y5 deals with the order of dressing Aaron and his sons. B9 asks the question, how did he, Moses, dress them, Aaron and his sons, but then immediately questions the question and offers a quick dismissive answer. How did he dress them? That which was. Who cares? B. Yomã then recasts the question, but again, the quick and dismissive response is essentially what will be, will be. B. Yomã then offers a third statement of the question, which is, how did he dress them, to explain the logic of the verses. B. Yomã is clearly less interested in the sartorial details of the Miluim week. To B. Yomã, explaining the logic of the verses is a worthwhile endeavor. Exploring the Miluim week on its own terms is not. Likewise, B. Yomã's apparently limited interest in the details of the Miluim week accounts for its omission of Y6 to Y7 and most of Y8, the essential purpose of which is to explore aspects of the Miluim week on their own terms. Section 5, micro-level intertalmudic reworkings or transpositions of Amoraic and Stam materials. This paper will now move briefly from macro to micro-level textual phenomena. Slide 6 takes us out of the textual core to B2. B2 notably presents a lengthy conceptual sugya which ends with a statement of Ravina presented in two versions, a Lishna Kama and an Ika Da'amre. The first version of Ravina resembles a statement presented Stam in Y1. B2's Ravina has been edited to fit the statement into its place as the culmination of 8 challenges in the preceding sugya, but the relationship to the Stam statement of Y1 is apparent. Slide 7 presents the inverse of slide 6. Rabbi Mana, perhaps or even likely with interpolated Stam in Y13, is presented entirely as Stam in B16. And this is an introduction now to a series of statements that I call an inconclusive conclusion. And now what to make of these various phenomena, I close with 7 points. Point 1, the Yerushalmi's Gemara to Yomã 1:1 is the direct literary inspiration for a substantial portion of the Babli's treatment of that Mishnah on Yomã 2a to 14a. Without Yomã 1:1, the Babylonian Gemara would look quite different. 2, I'm becoming increasingly less interested in a historical lens, the question of what happened when. I'm finding it more interesting to probe how edited Yerushalmi material is used in the Bavli rather than when it was first used. But shifting for a moment to the historical lens, there is no question that source materials moved between the land of Israel and Babylonia during the Amoraic period. The examples on slides 6 to 7, those two micro examples I just provided, could very well date to the Amoraic period. There may very well be such early stam available to the formulators of Yomã. I made a similar point in chapter 5 of A Talmud in Exile. But the point 3, the fact that Yerushalmi stam comes to be attributed to Ravina in slide 6, and that Ravina is edited to fit nicely as the end of a lengthy dialectical sugya, suggests that we cannot be certain about what stam is truly early and what was early but then reworked later by the formulators of Yomã. And if an identifiably early stam might have been reworked later by the formulators of Yomã, then we can't be absolutely certain that it came early to Babylonia. Point 4, the author, quote unquote, of such discrete examples of early stam need not and likely should not be identified with the formulators of Yomã. The formulators of Yomã and any other tractate should be referred to with terminology that distinguishes them from the stam. Point 5, what do the terms early and late really mean? Should we use dates? Probably not. But we should ask, when does it make the most sense to assume that Yomã 1:1 is a sequence of sugyot linked to Yomã 1:1 became known in Babylonia, during or after the Amoraic period? If during, then Amoraim are portrayed as unaware or uninterested in the sequence of sugyot as a sequence. If they knew what we now have as the textual core, they put it away in a closet for reasons we cannot now know. What makes more sense is to assume that Yomã 1:1 was unknown as such to the named Babylonian Amoraim and became known to whichever scholars display awareness of it and derive the textual core from it. Maybe these unknown scholars lived at the same time as the Amoraim, or maybe they lived later. These unknown scholars are the formulators of Yomã, and again, they should not be automatically conflated with the authors, quote unquote, of any and all anonymous traditions conventionally referred to as stam. These unknown scholars adapted Yomã 1:1 along with inherited Babylonian Amoraic material as the basis for Yomã 2a to 14a. Point 6, there are 37 Bavli tractates. As I have written previously, different Palestinian tractates may have had different fates in exile. Different Bavli tractates may have different relationships to edited Palestinian learning. As we say, one size does not fit all. And then finally, point 7, and with this I'll conclude, had we never become aware of Ketav Yad Leiden, had we never become aware of the Talmud Yerushalmi, had there never been an editio princeps of 1523, the structured macro-level contribution of the Palestinian Amoraim by way of the anonymous unknown formulators of many Bavli tractates might never have become known in quite this form. And so for this, we should be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alyssa. You can see all of us in my computer, the other window. If there are any comments or questions, I would encourage you to come here and speak to the mic.
Thank you, Alyssa. This is fascinating. Two quick questions just to be sure that I get you right. You think in this case the most economic way to account for Bavli and Yerushalmi Yomã 1:1 is that the Yerushalmi, more or less as we have it, was known to the Bavli at some stage? Or can we assume something more minimalistic, that as content was passing, structures were passing, and we don't have to assume that sugya as a sugya? And B, you made this distinction between Amoraim that were not aware, and then maybe later, or other kind of stamaim that were aware? How of the Amoraim, had they be aware, how can they discuss this kind of structure? How do you expect it to take place? And again, thank you. This was illuminating.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying I'm always happy to be minimalistic. I think in general, when I draw conclusions, I tend to be minimalistic. I've been skeptical for many years, and I want to immerse myself again in some of the newer studies of knowledge transmission and knowledge construction in late antiquity. I tend to get very skeptical of what I've always seen as facile assumptions that material just sort of moves between the two places without, being removed from its organic context in a study circle or some kind of beit midrash, that knowledge just somehow moves. So thinking about the fact that knowledge moves when we're able to put our minds around it, put it into a structure, understanding that you have sugyot and sequences of sugyot that come to be attached to the Mishnah, or they come to be attached to Braitot in the Tosefta or Braitot elsewhere, and that this, as I put it in this paper, is kind of a technology for moving this, makes sense. At that point, we get into questions that we can and will continue to debate. What do we call that? Those linked sequences of sugyot attached to the Mishnah. Do we call it linked sequences and these are just early Talmud Kadum or something like this? Or do we say, look, it's very similar to what we see in the Talmud Yerushalmi, so let's call it the Talmud Yerushalmi. We know that, we have the Talmud of Caesarea, we have, there is Talmud Yerushalmi floating around, so why not call it Talmud Yerushalmi? So again, I'm happy to be minimalist, I'm happy to be careful and refine and nuance, but at a certain point, it is Talmud Yerushalmi. Secondly, when it comes to the awareness, I apologize if maybe I tried to make a note of your question, if maybe I'm forgetting it. I think you ended on the note of, well, how would I expect the Amoraim to discuss this material as a whole? My question to you is, well, then why should I assume that they knew it because they're not discussing it? Why then should I make that assumption if I have no textual evidence that they're aware of that material? Why should I assume that they knew it? And again, once we begin, and Professor Zussman made this critical admission many years ago in Beshuv Yerushalmi Nizikin, once we acknowledge that there are additional layers of editing and revision, it really shakes our confidence about what we can with certainty say is early and what we can say is late. So putting these 2 points together, again, if I don't have evidence that they are aware of it, what is the reason? What concrete reason is there that I should assume that they are aware of it? And again, once we have changes being made, why should I, in fact, assume that it's early? I am continuing to think about these issues. Again, I have no stake. I do not earn royalties if the material is attributed to post-Amoraic scholars or scholars who lived during the Amoraic period. If there were scholars aware of it who lived during the Amoraic period, or if there were Amoraim who perhaps functioned in dual roles, one way attributed and another way anonymous, I'm open to that possibility. But to assume that Ravina, Rav Ashi, Rav Papa, that they knew these edited sequences without knowing something more about how they would know it, I find difficult to imagine. That said, I'll just close this answer with one more point. I do believe that there is evidence that when it comes to certain sequences of Toseftan passages, there are Amoraim who are demonstrably aware of them as sequences of Toseftan passages. And I've seen this in some of my studies of charity with sequences of charity Braitot from Tosefta Peah, that I do believe there are Amoraim that are aware of them. But again, I'm not seeing the same thing with these units of structural similarity, what I'm calling the textual core in this paper. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. So I think we'll call the session. Thank you so much, Elisa, for sharing with us this wise and meticulous and illuminating study. אנחנו ניקח הפסקה וניפגש פה ברבע ל-4. תודה רבה לחנן מאזר, תודה רבה להלל וייטנר.